Imagine being newly diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and having your doctor say to you, "I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is you have MS. The good news is you're not going to get dementia." Well, hello and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam. I've been living with multiple sclerosis for almost 40 years. You may have been seeing some articles, because this has definitely been making the news, that people with multiple sclerosis seem to be at a greatly reduced risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. Now that is pretty fantastic, I would have to say. Having lived with MS for so long, I have always felt that I could deal with the physical limitations that MS has brought into my life, but I have always dreaded the mental limitations that some people have reported. And I figured, oh well, and then on top of that, what if I get dementia? Then life is going to be really challenging. So I was really grateful to see this new finding, this new discovery. That's, like I said, it's really making the news, because it's really good news both for us and for people who are concerned that they might someday get Alzheimer's, especially those who are having some cognitive difficulties now and are wondering if that's due to their MS or due to Alzheimer's. I want to get into an article, but first, before I do that, I just want to play a video because it's kind of the same information, but I like the way it covers everything in a pretty short time and easy to understand. And if you don't want to wade through the article and everything else, you can at least watch this and get the gist of the new discovery that has happened.
Researchers noticed something unusual. MS patients under their care seemed to be less likely to develop Alzheimer's as they aged, even those with a family history of the disease. To investigate further, they conducted a study involving 100 MS patients and compared them to 300 people without MS. The results were intriguing. The study used advanced brain scans and blood tests to detect amyloid plaques, which are a hallmark of Alzheimer's. What they found was surprising. MS patients were less likely to have these plaques in their brains. This suggests that there might be something about having MS that offers some form of protection against Alzheimer's. But how could MS protect against Alzheimer's? One theory involves microglia, which are immune cells that act as the brain's cleanup crew. During MS flare-ups, the immune system goes into overdrive, attacking the nervous system. This might cause microglia to become more active, clearing out amyloid plaques more effectively. If MS patients have more active microglia, this could explain why they might have a lower risk of Alzheimer's. While these findings are promising, more research is needed to understand the full picture. Scientists plan to look deeper into the genetic aspects of these findings and conduct studies on lab animals to observe how amyloid plaques develop in the presence of MS. This could potentially lead to new treatments for Alzheimer's by harnessing the brain's natural defense mechanisms. Although this research is still in its early stages, it offers new hope for understanding and combating Alzheimer's disease. If these protective mechanisms can be better understood, they could open the door to innovative therapies for Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases.
Okay, now that we've looked at the video, let's go ahead and look at the article. I saw this in Multiple Sclerosis News today. It came out on August 27th, 2024. MS patients less likely to have Alzheimer's, study finds. MS appears protective against Alzheimer's damage. You saw that correctly, protective. Now that, if it's true, is pretty amazing. The article goes on to say people with multiple sclerosis are about half as likely as those without the disease to have signs of the amyloid beta plaques in the brain that are a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, according to a study in the U.S. So half as likely. So your chances have been cut in half. It doesn't mean you can't possibly get it, but your chances are much less. Our findings imply that some component of the biology of multiple sclerosis or the genetics of MS patients is protective against Alzheimer's disease, Matthew Breyer, MD, PhD, the study's first author and an assistant professor at Washington University's School of Medicine in St. Louis, said in a university news story, "The reason behind the link remains unknown. The study, Unexpected Low Rate of Amyloid Beta Pathology in Multiple Sclerosis Patients," was published as a brief communication in the Annals of Neurology. In MS, the immune system mistakenly attacks the myelin, the fatty sheath around nerve fibers in the brain and spinal cord, causing symptoms such as muscle weakness, poor vision, and numbness. It can also cause cognitive problems, including memory loss. These symptoms could be confused with symptoms of Alzheimer's, the most common cause of dementia. But they're seeing a link between MS and Alzheimer's risk. Ann Cross, MD, an MS specialist at the university, found it interesting that her patients rarely developed Alzheimer's, even though they were old enough to be at risk for it. "I noticed that I couldn't find a single MS patient of mine who had typical Alzheimer's disease," Cross said. "If they had cognitive problems, I would send them to the memory and aging specialist here at WashU Medicine for an Alzheimer's assessment, and those doctors would always come back and tell me, 'No, this is not due to Alzheimer's disease.'" Cross teamed up with Breyer and other researchers to study whether people with MS have the same risk of developing Alzheimer's as those without the condition. The researchers used Precivity-AD2, a blood test from C2N Diagnostics that's approved in the U.S. to predict the presence of amyloid beta plaques in the brain. These toxic protein clumps are a hallmark and a driver of Alzheimer's-associated neurodegeneration. Precivity-AD2 looks for signs of Alzheimer's in the blood by measuring three key indicators: the ratio of two forms of a protein called tau, the ratio of two forms of amyloid beta protein, and a score called the Amyloid Probability Score, APS2, which predicts the likelihood of having Alzheimer's. The team recruited 100 people older than 60 with MS and compared their Precivity-AD2 results with those of 300 sex and age-matched adults without MS. These controls, who could have either normal or impaired cognitive function, had similar rates of an Alzheimer's genetic risk factor called APOE to MS patients. Results showed that people with MS were about half as likely to have signs of Alzheimer's as controls. For example, the proportion of people with a positive APS2 score was more than twice as high among those without MS, 15.3% versus 7.1%, meaning they were more likely to have amyloid beta plaques than MS patients. Similar observations were made for the tau ratio, 18.3% versus 9%. When the researchers performed brain scans on 11 MS patients, they found that the blood test results generally matched the brain imaging findings, especially for the APS2 and tau ratio. This means the Precivity-AD2 test is reliable for predicting amyloid beta plaques in the brain. The findings suggest that MS may protect against Alzheimer's. Moreover, MS patients positive for either APS2 or tau ratio were significantly more likely, by up to 23 times, to have two or more atypical MS features at diagnosis, suggesting that a more typical MS profile was even more protective against Alzheimer's. The researchers also studied the effects of a gene called APOE, which is linked to Alzheimer's. They found that patients carrying one or two copies of APOE3, the most common genetic APOE variant that is linked to an average risk of Alzheimer's, had lower APS2 and tau ratio than those without MS. This protective effect wasn't seen in MS patients with two copies of APOE4, a variant linked to a more than twofold higher risk of Alzheimer's. The results suggest that MS is associated with a low prevalence of amyloid-related damage based on blood biomarkers, the researchers wrote. If we could identify what aspect is protective and apply it in a controlled way, that could inform therapeutic strategies for Alzheimer's disease, Breyer said. And of course, it could be a real boon for those of us with MS, right? And it looks to me like what they're saying here is that whatever they mean by a more typical MS profile, if you have that, then you're even more protected against Alzheimer's. I'm not entirely sure we would know that other than to have measured these ABS2 and tau ratio biomarkers, but you know what? That's a blood test I suppose you could have done if you're curious. Well, as exciting as that was, I am not usually going to report to you on something and certainly not get excited about something if I've only seen it in one source. Even though that was a published paper by reputable scientists, it made me feel a lot more comfortable and confident about this when I saw that Dr. Gavin Giovannoni, in his MSLP newsletter, covers this same topic. He looks at this same paper and he shares in the optimism. As he says, cognitive impairment, is it due to multiple sclerosis or Alzheimer's disease? So what his article is going to cover is that while we know MS comes with cognitive problems, and those are very common, they may not be Alzheimer's, and perhaps we need to be looking at that a little differently. As he says, I have always assumed that people with multiple sclerosis are protected from getting Alzheimer's disease. Why? Well, that's interesting. He's always assumed that. I would be interested to know why he would always have assumed that. Well, this came out on August 26th. As he says, a week doesn't go past without one of my patients asking me if their worsening cognition and forgetfulness are due to multiple sclerosis or if they have Alzheimer's disease. Does this sound familiar to you? I tell them that people with MS are protected from getting Alzheimer's, and their cognitive issues are likely to be due to MS and superimposed aging, anxiety, and depression, or side effects of medication or another reason. For example, poor sleep, excessive alcohol consumption, etc. And then he goes on to talk about these different things in more detail. Anxiety and depression. Yes, people with MS who complain of memory problems often have anxiety and/or depression that can explain their symptoms. This can be screened for on history or simple screening questionnaires, such as the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Index. I don't think I've ever taken that test. You can self-administer and score yourself using the HAD scale. And there's a link. I see that this is hyperlinked, so you could go look at that. Or it could be due to concomitant medications, so medications you're taking at the same time. Many people with MS are on medications that are sedating and impair cognitive function. This includes antispastic agents, anticholinergics, gabapentinoids, opioids, antihistamines, cannabinoids, and anticonvulsants. Polypharmacy is common in people with MS, and if you have cognition problems, you should see if you can come off medications that make cognition worse. In my MS practice, baclofen and centrally acting anticholinergics are the biggest culprits. If this is new to you, please read the following newsletters. And he has a couple of links there. And then he talks about sleep. I have written extensively about the fact that most people with MS have a sleep disorder. Many people with MS have obstructive sleep apnea. If you are not getting good quality sleep, you suffer from daytime sleepiness, fatigue, and cognitive problems. I include excess alcohol consumption with sleep as it disrupts your sleep. However, prolonged alcohol misuse is associated with neurotoxicity and cognitive impairment over and above its effects on sleep. And then he's got a couple of links of newsletters he has published on that topic. He talks about other conditions and diseases. Persons with MS may develop other diseases that can be associated with cognitive problems. This includes hyper and hypothyroidism, vitamin B12 deficiency, electrolyte abnormalities, chronic renal or liver impairment, small vessel disease or multiple strokes, CNS infections, HIV, syphilis, chronic meningitis, etc. If your cognitive problems are new and worsening, You should have investigations to exclude these other conditions and diseases. And then he talks about aging and Alzheimer's disease. Yes, MS shreds your brain and cognitive reserve and makes you more susceptible to the effects of aging. Cognitive reserve refers to the brain's ability to adapt and function despite damage. It is influenced by factors such as education, occupation, and lifestyle. Studies have shown that individuals with higher cognitive reserve may be more resilient to cognitive decline in MS and Alzheimer's. The patterns of cognitive decline seen in MS typically differ from those seen in Alzheimer's. These deficits affect attention, information processing speed, working memory, and executive functioning. Meanwhile, in typical Alzheimer's, memory is predominantly affected, at least initially. The type of dementia that MS causes is quite different to that seen with Alzheimer's. Many years ago, when I was early in my MS career, I asked the head of neuropathology at Queen Square, my previous institution, how common MS and Alzheimer's were found at post-mortem. He said to me that in over 200 brain bank MS cases, he had never seen both MS and Alzheimer's. He had good data on this because the brain bank's protocol for processing tissue included staining for amyloid or Alzheimer's pathology, and the head of neuropathology was a very good pathologist. It is a pity we never wrote up this finding. However, since then, I have assumed that persons with MS are protected from getting Alzheimer's. A recent study published in the Annals of Neurology, and that's the paper that the other article referred to, showed that persons with MS have lower amyloid beta plasma positivity, a marker of Alzheimer's pathology, compared to non-MS controls. And he has a link to the paper below as well. This observation is very important as it may tell us something about the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's and could lead to new and exciting ways to prevent and treat Alzheimer's. I have lots of ideas about why MS protects you from getting Alzheimer's, but not enough time to research them. Wow. Okay, well, now that Dr. Giovannoni is excited, I guess I have permission to be excited as well. But not so fast. We do need to take a look really quickly at a study that was published in January of 2022 out of the University of Michigan, Diagnosis of Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementia Among People with Multiple Sclerosis, Large Cohort Study, USA. And I'm not going to read this, but I do want us to look just at the highlights of this study, which they conveniently made in bullet form. It says here that the incidence of early on ADRD was 7 times higher among adults with MS compared to adults without MS. And ADRD stands for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. The second bullet says that among older adults 65 and over with multiple sclerosis, incident ADRD was 4.0% compared to 3.3% among those without MS. And then adjusted survival models indicated that adults with MS had a 4 times higher risk for early onset ADRD diagnosis. Well, that was quite concerning to me because 2022 wasn't all that long ago. So why are the results so different from the ones that we just were talking about? Well, I thought the only way to really know that one for sure was to go and ask somebody that knows what he's talking about. So I went out to Professor G's MS Selfie newsletter page for that particular article we were just looking at, and I asked him this question. I said that it's interesting that based on your and your colleagues' observations, that you have long assumed that persons with MS were protected from Alzheimer's disease. Did you have a theory as to why that might be? It seems quite counterintuitive, actually, and the 2022 study by Mahmoudi et al., and I gave him the link, found just the opposite. I'd rather believe you, of course, and his reply was very helpful. He said that the study you are referring to is done using electronic records and relies on coding the correct diagnosis. The studies I am referring to are based on the pathological confirmation of Alzheimer's disease. I suspect the electronic record study is due in part to misdiagnosis, in other words, MS-associated dementia being coded as Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's relies on the accumulation of protein aggregates in the brain. I suspect that the activation of microglia by MS counteracts this, in that microglia clean up the brain and hence prevent Alzheimer's pathology taking a hold. So doesn't that make you feel a lot better? Because you may be told about that older study and you may also have the same questions that I had. But what he's basically saying is that, and I've talked about this in other videos, the study that came out in 2022 relied a lot on data that was collected by others. So essentially, it was sort of a meta-analysis of data that had been collected in other studies by other people. And there is a high probability in cases like that the data has not been collected consistently or is not of the highest quality. Mistakes get made and they get propagated through the results. And then you draw conclusions based on data that you don't even really know the quality of. And that's what he's really saying here. And his own conclusions were based on doctors who actually were conducting these autopsies and finding that if you had Alzheimer's, you didn't have MS, and vice versa. So that makes me feel a lot better, and I hope it makes you feel better too. What I'm gathering from these studies is that these same microglia that in the case of MS get a little overzealous and start attacking things they shouldn't are kind of the cleanup crew for amyloid plaques that lead to Alzheimer's disease. Very interesting. So I guess it's just a question of making sure the microglia remember what their mission is and don't go chomping on things you shouldn't be chomping on. Okay, we have something to celebrate. If the chances of getting Alzheimer's in my later life, and I guess I sort of am at my later life now, at almost 65, if I can be pretty well assured that I'll go through my life and not get Alzheimer's, I think I'll be pretty happy, even if my MS never gets cured. I also have to say, you saw the tone of all of the articles, is that this is really good news for people who are worried about getting Alzheimer's, because if they're understanding a little more about what's going on at the cellular level with microglia, then they're certainly going to be able to apply that to Alzheimer's research with hopefully some fruitful results, so that perhaps others besides just those of us with MS can benefit from this reduced risk of Alzheimer's. So I guess I would have to say that's good news all around, and I hope you agree. But that's all I have for you today. So until my next video, please continue to take really good care of yourself.